Hi, it's so great to be here with you all this morning. My name is Elizabeth Charash. To begin my talk, I want to ask you all to think about, what do you picture in your head when you hear the word hero? Do you picture superheroes like Iron Man, Superman, Wonder Woman? Do you picture civil rights icons like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks or Medgar Evers? Or do you picture legal warriors like my two personal ultimate heroes, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Hillary Clinton? There's a common trend among all of these names just listed. They see a problem in the world, and then they take action to mitigate that issue and address that issue in an informed manner. But not everyone makes it to this list of what we classify to be hero. And those individuals sometimes can't take the action to do so, or they've taken the action, but they don't receive the recognition because they don't have the support networks that encourage them to go out into the world, or they don't have the opportunity to engage. This feeds into a broader narrative of who gets to be a worthy hero, because not everyone gets to wear a Super Diva sweatshirt like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or a cape like Superman. One such hero is Claudette Colvin. And a lot of us don't know her name because when she started the bus boycotts and the bus protests in Montgomery, Alabama, the NAACP actually led with her name on their case. But she was a teenager, she was pregnant, she was unwed, and she didn't fit the image of what they wanted in the civil rights movement. So they replaced her face in her textbooks with Rosa Parks, a more docile figure, ignoring her history as well as an incredible advocate. This happens across social movements. It's not just civil rights, where we pick the worthy and the unworthy to define as who is hero and who is not. Today, I'm going to focus on the gun violence prevention movement. To provide a little bit of background about myself, I'm originally from Newtown, Connecticut. I was a junior in high school when the shooting at Sandy Hook occurred a little less than a mile away from my high school. The experiences in lockdown led me to take action within my own grassroots group in town, Newtown Action Alliance. Through them, I had the opportunity to lobby in DC and on Capitol Hill with legislators from across the country. We also got to work with advocates from across the nation who had begun to work on the issue long before Sandy Hook, or were people like me who started at that moment. They exposed me to so much more than the experiences in my town, informing me about issues within intimate partner violence, suicide with firearms, gang violence, and urban violence. And even that day, there was a shooting at the Navy Yard right down the road from the Capitol. As I sat in my first meeting, there was a massive bay window, and you could look out and see helicopters swarming in the distance. And while families were being notified that their loved ones would not be coming home that day, we were exchanging pleasantries and how are you doing and getting cups of coffee. And those conversations we were having were still focused on mass shootings. We didn't talk about those impacted in intimate partner violence. We didn't talk about those impacted in acts of suicide. The woman sitting to my right had lost her 7-year-old daughter on the south side of Chicago selling lemonade on her summer break, killed by bullets. 7 years old. Close in age to the children at Sandy Hook, yet when we think of the heroes of the gun violence prevention movement, her mother and her name is not included. Why does this happen? Why do we pick one particular narrative, one solution, to describe a movement and an epidemic that is so much more complex than a mass shooting? There was a pastor in Hartford, Sam Saylor, and he brought this up, this inequality in the movement, this inequality in the recognition of those who've been impacted by gun violence. He traveled down to DC with us. 3 months prior, in October of that year, his son had been killed, murdered walking past the playground he played on as a young kid. His girlfriend was pregnant with her child, who is now 5 years old and will never know their father. But we don't talk about shame. We don't talk about Pastor Saylor in our conversations we have about the heroes of gun violence prevention, because the circumstances that surround those deaths make us uncomfortable. And it's this discomfort that limits the ability we have to progress as a movement to actually address the issue of gun violence. We need to recognize all voices. We need to recognize those who have been killed, injured, and those who fiercely advocate on their behalf. Because this ignorance, this silence, this fear we have of conversation about uncomfortable topics isn't going to go away. In 2016, 38,000 people were killed by gun violence. 38,000. 2/3 of those deaths were firearm by suicide. 2/3 suicide by firearm. The same silence we apply to those killed by gang violence, we apply to those who struggle with mental illness. And then we scapegoat those with mental illness as that's the reason why gun violence persists in our country, ignoring the complexities that led someone to get a gun and the complexities of violence that goes with that. And when we ignore those complexities, we ignore the 50 women that will die this month at the hands of an intimate partner with a firearm. We ignore their stories because women and children are disproportionately impacted in mass shootings. We also ignore the 22 veterans that will die today by suicide. 22 veterans, most with a firearm. And while these narratives are slightly incorporated into the gun violence prevention movement, they don't receive the same oomph factor, the same headline as a mass shooting does. So, how do we move past this? How do we incorporate these voices to actually address what's going on? If we're going to actually address this issue, we can't just sing Kumbaya by a campfire. We sadly can't just march in one particular march, like the March for Our Lives this past March, or to do the school walkouts led by incredible students across this nation. Because the issues of prejudice, the issues of fear that undergird and cause this silence from the very beginning won't be addressed in one day or at one event. We need to actually come to grips with our biases if we're ever to understand the racism, sexism, and ableism that have been cultivated in this nation for many centuries. And the solution is fact. We need to have credible information from our research institutes and our federal government. We need to see gun violence as the issue that it is, a public health crisis, so we can address it as the epidemic that it is. We need to take narrative and fact together, combining them to understand how racism, sexism, and ableism has developed for so many years in our country. We must listen. We must constantly pursue the truth, and we must be kind, because gun violence impacts all of us. We need to recognize the diversity of the movement, and not just incorporate those voices, but grant them leadership in its direction. The students in Parkland are doing that now, but we must all work together, because not all heroes have the chance to be heard. Thank you so much.